What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about episode 3 of American Horror Stories entitled Drive-In. And one of the things before we get too far into this, like always, I'm going to be doing a very brief breakdown of everything that happened in this episode, although I don't think it's going to take too much time because, quite frankly, not a whole lot happened here. In fact, in retrospect, I just wanted to go back to last week's 2-episode premiere and say that's one of my biggest gripes with this entire concept of a series. It's not so much the fact that anthology series like American Horror Stories can't work. Obviously, we've seen this play out in many different forms over the last couple of decades, and with a lot of those shows like The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, things like Black Mirror for the modern age, those shows turn out fantastic. And while not each individual episode really makes an impact, it's clear that the overall product deserves to exist. And that kind of brings me back to American Horror Stories. One of the things that I was really pessimistic about when it comes to this kind of concept, taking a well-established anthology series that takes an entire season to tell its story and breaking that universe down into one individual episode to tell a very contained story, is on its face an interesting idea, but one that was always a little bit iffy when it comes to these writers and the people who create this type of content. On the one hand, throughout its entire run, American Horror Story has had just a very fun, energetic personality to itself. So much so that, at least in theory, making it a one-off is something that would actually work. However, one of the biggest problems from the flagship show that has seemingly made its way into the spinoff is they have this problem with big ideas that they can't seem to wrap their head around in 8 episodes, 9 episodes, however many each individual season is. And the fear on all of that was going to come back in American Horror Stories, where you introduce an interesting concept, but when you only give yourself one episode to really work through it, you cannot reach its full potential, and ultimately everything feels a little bit rushed. So that's really one of the things I would love to discuss in the comments section. But with all that being said, let's jump into what happens in this episode. And like I said, not a whole lot. So we open up the episode with Chad and Kelly trying to get it on while watching Bob Ross, because I guess just like, oh, didn't expect that in American Horror Story, but came off a little bit more cringe than it probably should have. Anyway, the thrust of the story is this guy wants in his girlfriend's pants. She's not letting him. They both really want each other, but she's a little bit afraid of the intimacy and he's afraid of not actually getting anything. So Chad's friends decide that the best way for this to happen is for them to go to a drive-in movie called Rabbit Rabbit that is going to be like the most scary movie of all time, because it only really showed once back in 1986, and after that showing so many people killed each other that the California Senate, or just the Senate in general, decided to ban the film altogether, destroying every single copy besides this one particular copy that emerged like almost 40 years later. From there, I think you can imagine exactly what happens. Everybody who's established in the show ends up going to the movie. They watch just a little bit of it. Some people are spared, including our 2 main characters, because of a little hanky-panky going on during the film in the parking lot, while everyone else turns into literal zombies. And that's really kind of one of the biggest problems I have with this episode. It isn't the fact that a film turns people into crazed killing machines. It's the way in which that occurs and the way it's portrayed that kind of bothers me. Like, all in all, this is a really cool idea and one I would really like to see explored a little bit more. But the problem is, as I said at the very beginning of the video, the idea is interesting enough, but the fact that they have to get it over with in 48 minutes plays somewhat of a big role in how all of this turns out. And in order to elaborate on that just a little bit more, I have to go a little bit further into what happens during the rest of the episode, because there's not that much more. After the events of the drive-in, Chad and Kelly realize that the only way that they can stop this is actually by finding the director of the movie and not only killing him, but burning every single copy that he has. And while that sounds just really, really dumb, because obviously there was a lot more people besides them who are probably also not watching the movie and got away to tell the police, they just decide amongst themselves that no, the police are not going to believe us, despite the fact that there's hundreds of bodies just sprawled out of there. And this has a history. I mean, I feel like at this point it's kind of a proven method and they would go after who's really responsible. I kind of get the fact that we don't want to get caught up in all the investigations, but you're there, people know you're there. Like, how would you get away with that anyway? And how after 5 hours of all of this are they just literally there without any police presence? Because that's something I didn't really go into because there's just so much that happens in this episode that's just useless and it just keeps going way too fast. They haul up in the projection room at the drive-in and then 5 hours pass and there's no police presence but hundreds of dead bodies in this entire place. It's really dumb. Anyway, they take it upon themselves to hunt down the director, find him, blow his kneecaps out, and burn the footage. The two interesting things about that entire exchange is that the reason the movie makes people crazy is because John Carroll Lynch, who's always fantastic in American Horror Story and pretty much any other role that he wants to do, starts talking about the process of making the movie and all of these subliminal messages that end up in the movie that kind of put people in a crazy state of mind. It's a really interesting concept, no time to explore it, we have to end the show. Then we also get the idea that both Kelly and Chad watched a little bit of the movie and that changed them, not just from the crazy sort that people are going around zombie-like and killing everybody, but really changing their attitude and seeing it in the fact that they're able to kill him, burn his house down, and then go and, finally do the deed because the movie literally changed them. Those two concepts, fantastic. I feel like we should explore them more, but nope, we have to get this story done so everyone turns into a zombie. Instead of, maybe some people watch a little bit of clips of it on YouTube or something like that, and that causes them to change their attitude. It turns people into serial killers. It's more of a slow, methodical process or something. No. Zombies literally eating faces and stabbing people and doing all these weird zombie things, even though they're not zombies. Guys, I have to call it like I see it. This episode is really bad. I talked about this last week with the first 2 episodes in the series, saying that going back to Murder House was a bit of a crutch. We know this place, we know the rules around it, and we know generally what happens there. So you can focus a lot more on the characters and you don't have to explain what's going on in the overall world or where the horror comes from. The problem was always going to be, how do you create new characters and a new environment with new rules and a new scary concept that was going to fill an entire episode and make it seem self-contained. And I have to say that with the 3 offerings that we've gotten thus far, this show hasn't figured out a way to do that, and that's kind of depressing because I still really want the best from this series. The first episode of American Horror Stories was really good. If they ended it there, it would have been fine. They went way too far into it and they gave it a happy ending, which I am just not a fan of. This episode did a little bit more in giving us somewhat of a happy ending because you kind of need that, but also leaving the door open into somewhat of a darker world. The problem with all of that is because we saw how this affects people so aggressively, so quickly, and just makes people zombies for, better or worse, it's less interesting than what it could have been. And I don't know. I really wish it was better. Like I said, John Carroll Lynch is probably the best part of this episode because he's usually one of the best parts in American Horror Story, so there's that. But this one is a big dud, and considering the fact that it's the first original episode in this entire season, I'm hoping for better next week. Before I go, I have a couple of points that I didn't really want to discuss anywhere in the review besides just here at the end, so take that what you will. First off, I did have a theory that this episode would explore the first 2 episodes being a movie within the universe, kind of taking the idea that somebody within American Horror Stories universe took the concept of Murder House and just made a movie around it. That's why it felt really different compared to every other time that we've seen it. That did not end up happening, and I'm kind of disappointed that it didn't. Second, one of the things that I've been seeing a lot in the comment section is people who are generally mad about the level of quote-unquote wokeness that American Horror Stories has been bringing to the table, or just American Horror Story in general. And I don't really quite understand it. I understand why people would have that sentiment because I've, been around the internet, but if the idea that a movie that kills people, a house that's haunted with all these ghosts over like 100 years, or, Asylum, Witches in the Coven, Apocalypse, all that stuff you can get over. I feel like the idea of, lesbian girl who's also a little bit of masochist is, not the most ridiculous concept. With that being said, I don't really want to have this discussion in the comments, but I'm sure people will have a disagreeing opinion. I don't really find the need to introduce a character like D in this episode. Nothing wrong with it. It's just, if you're going to do a character like that, or pretty much any of these characters, if you're going to tell a story like this, then make it worthwhile. Tell like a compelling story, tell it with compelling characters. And I feel like the fact that this episode was so quick and that character was so small, it calls more attention to itself than it otherwise would have if it was a more traditional role, if I could say that. And that's kind of sad. I feel like if this was an entire season, that character would probably be one of my favorites. As it stands now, it just kind of came and went, and it was just there for shock value. So finally, I really did like the nod, or at least subtle joke, to Ryan Murphy's deal with Netflix at the very end of the episode. That was good on this episode. I feel like that was one of the best things they did. Guys, please like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that bell over by the subscriber button to notify you every single time I upload, because we will be talking a little bit more about American Horror Stories sometime later this week and next week, with a couple of discussions that Dallas and I are really interested in bringing to you guys, because just, based off of the couple of comments that I've seen, I'm pretty sure a lot of people really want to dive into this stuff.